Okay, let's get going. Oh, a few people today. Was there an exam or anything going on? Food analysis? What? That's easy. It's a very easy quiz. Okay. Well, first, happy Wednesday and happy last lecture in proteins. I'll miss you guys. No, not going to miss you. You're not going to miss me either. Okay, so let's start with recap questions like always. And if you answer, please do send your participation note to Sophia since she's still traveling. Okay, what is a net charge on a protein? What do we mean when we say a net charge? Go ahead.
The sum of the charges from the amino acids groups when you look at the total protein.
Very good. So depending on the composition of the protein, you'll have different amino acids with different charges, and the net charge is the combination of pluses and minuses, and the net charge impact protein solubility, which is a very important characteristic. Okay, define protein denaturation. I'm just going to go with Emily.
It's when the protein
Yes, when the protein unfolds, but can you give a little bit more description, Axel?
Free energy rises.
Exactly. Free energy rises. There is a change in the structure from its native form. And then, of course, because we have free energy that rises, it's not going to stay stable until it takes another conformation. So it will take a different structure. So that's why it's called denaturation. It will have a different structure from the natural structure. Okay. How does water facilitate thermal denaturation? What happens when you have very low water concentration, a dry powder, versus protein in solution? Go ahead, Katie.
when there's a lot of water, so it's dry, it's more stable.
Exactly. So when it's dry powder, the protein is in a static condition where there's not a lot of movement. However, when you add water to the system and you heat, water is going to penetrate into the protein structure because of kinetic energy. So, and it's going to break hydrogen bonding between the residues, and the residue starts bonding with the water. So there will be swelling and more tendency to open up and denature. Okay. Why high protein concentration may result in irreversible denaturation upon heating? So if you have high protein concentration, exactly, or if you have a lot of protein, and then you heat the solution, there will be a lot of movement and they will bombard into each other, and if they are denatured, you will have them come closer. There can be hydrophobic interactions since the residues are exposed now. And if they have free sulfide group, they could form disulfide linkages, and this becomes irreversible. What are some denaturing agents? There are several, Tiffany. Partial hydrolysis by enzyme, you are changing the primary structure. Alex, you wanted to say something? Organic solvent, do you want to explain why? Exactly. So the hydrophobic residues now can be exposed and interact with water. Is that Sarah? Heat, of course. Heat is going to denature. Detergents. You wanted to say that. Molly. What's that? Oh, physical denaturation, like kneading the dough or beating an egg. Great. There's one more, I think. Emma? Salt. Yes. High salt concentration is, actually there are several more. High salt concentration is going to cause the breakage of ionic interactions and affect the charge on the protein and the way it's going to interact with the water. There is a couple more. Then, we already said that. But good. pH, extreme pH, high acidic and or high alkaline, because you'll end up with like charges and again break electrostatic interactions. One last one. Sulfides, breaking the sulfide, so by reducing agents. Great, good. We've summed it all up. Okay, and this was the last slide that I showed last lecture. We talked about denaturation, and then, but there are methods to evaluate protein denaturation, and there are several of them. And you'll learn about them more in detail if you take chemical reactions next spring. But I just want to just talk about a few, just FYI, without going into too much detail. How would you determine protein denaturation? Can you guess? No? Okay, so change in structure. Change in structure could be detected by measuring surface hydrophobicity, for example. And you can do that by chemical assay. Let me show you what we have. Well, I didn't list surface hydrophobicity here, but it's one of them. NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, it can detect changes in structure, of course, because it's a very highly sophisticated instrument for structure characterization. IR, here's an example of Raman spectroscopy, which is in an IR spectra, infrared spectra. You look at structural change, which has to do with molecular or functional groups. Functional groups on a protein will change when the protein is denatured. So it can detect beta sheet changes, alpha helix changes, random coil changes, because you will have different spectra. I'm not going to go much into detail. Like I said, in chemical reaction, you will. Differential scanning calorimetry, you can do so many things with differential scanning calorimetry. I don't know if Ted talked about a little bit glass transition, for example. Yeah? Okay, with this instrument, same instrument, you can also measure protein denaturation temperature and onset of denaturation, and measure enthalpy, which is the containment of energy. Measuring UV absorption and fluorescence, aromatic amino acids are the ones that absorb UV light. So when a protein, and they are hydrophobic, so they tend to be inside the protein. So when the protein is denatured, they are partially exposed, and then you will see higher absorption. Solubility test, because when the protein denatures, oftentimes solubility decreases. So proteins want to interact with each other rather than with the water. So you can do that. Digestibility. A partial denaturation enhances digestibility because enzymes will have more access to binding sites. However, if the protein polymerizes, it will become large polymer and digestibility reduces. So if you see a change in digestibility, you can detect denaturation. Activity, especially if it's an enzyme. Enzymes are proteins, so if you see a decrease in enzyme activity, that will be due to denaturation of the protein. And oh, this is I forgot to click. This is a DSC thermogram, we call it, and it shows the denaturation temperature. When we see a peak, we call this endothermic peak, and it gives you the enthalpy, and it gives you the temperature at which the proteins open up. That's it. Like I said, you will learn more about it in detail in a different course. Okay, so far what we've done is we talked about intrinsic factors, impact on protein structure, extrinsic factors, impact on denaturation of the protein, and change in structure. So and now with that, how we want to learn a little bit about functionality and how the functionality is impacted by structure and environmental changes. So today we're going to talk about solubility, water binding, solubility, and gelation. In different lectures, you're going to talk about different colloidal systems such as emulsions and foam, and I'm not going to talk about it here. But of course, proteins can be excellent emulsifiers and foam agents. So what is a functional property? Functional property is any physicochemical property, so you want to know this, which affects processing and behavior of food systems as judged by quality attributes of the final product. So in simple term, functionality affects structure and texture of your food. Okay? So, and that relates to the quality. So the functional property is influenced by complex interactions. So it has to do with the composition of the protein, its final structure, the physicochemical properties, that means net charge, hydrophobicity, and other food components. So it would be interaction with other food components like sugars or fat in the system or water. And of course, the nature of the environment, pH, ionic strength, temperature, solvents. So it is influenced by, like I said, in simple terms, intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors that we talked about already. This is a nice summary table that shows functionality of a protein. There's so many different functionality. The mechanism, so solubility, for example, mechanism, has to do with hydrophilicity or the liking of water, especially on the surface of the protein. And application in beverages, protein beverages, and then most protein used in such application is whey protein. So to study, when you're studying this table, it would be good to have a complete example of a function, a mechanism, a food application, and a protein type. So if you're asked in an exam to give an example, that would be a good table to study. Okay. So the functionality of the protein is governed by certain mechanisms. So we have two categories of mechanisms. So the one category is the hydrodynamic or aggregation. Hydrodynamic has to do with interaction with water. Aggregation has to do with protein-protein interactions. So interaction with water, the functionality that would represent this is solubility and water holding capacity. I will define water holding capacity in a minute here. Interaction of protein, water, protein impacts the viscosity of the system, like sauces, for example, or muffin batter needs to have a certain viscosity. Elasticity, such as in a dough, the protein contributes to elasticity because it interacts with water as well as another protein in the system. So gluten-forming protein will interact with each other, but water is required to form the network. Without the water, the network is not formed. And then, of course, gelation, coagulation. So gelation such as in yogurt, coagulation such as in curd formation or cheese curd formation. Gelation is also like in a jelly or in a meat application where you have a three-dimensional network. You have protein, water, protein interaction. So you require all these interactions. So the other mechanism or category for functionality is, we call it the hydrophobic surface activity, or the activity at the interface. The interface is the area between two phases, like the liquid phase, aqueous phase, sorry, and oil phase. So the interface is where they interact or where they meet. In order to put them in a homogeneous or make them homogeneous structure or system, you need to have an emulsifier in this case, and the protein surface properties allow it to emulsify. Now, also another interface is between air and aqueous, so generating the foam. Again, the interface would be the area that separates these two phases, but then if you have a protein, you will end up with a homogeneous foam because of stabilizing the two different phases. So the surface of the protein and the activity on the surface is defined as surface activity. So you want to have a protein that is able to interact with water, on the surface and also interact with a lipid phase on the surface, or air and aqueous. So that's why we call it surface activity, and you need a certain degree of hydrophobicity on the surface. If the protein is very hydrophilic on the surface, like whey protein, for example, it won't be able to emulsify or form a foam. So you need a certain level of hydrophobicity on the surface. But on the counterpart, if the protein is very hydrophobic on the surface, it won't interact with water either. So it won't function well as well. So we call this a surface balance of hydrophobic to hydrophilic components. So you need to have a certain balance to act as an emulsifier or a foam. So what impacts viscosity, undulation, and thickening and texturization is really the size of the protein and the configuration of the protein. So larger proteins usually form viscous solutions and tend to gel better than small proteins. And we'll talk more about that. Again, in order to emulsify or foam, you need to have certain surface properties, hydrophobicity and charge or hydrophilicity, because you want the protein to be soluble. If the protein is not soluble, it's not going to do anything. It's going to fall out of solution. Not emulsify, not foam. So again, you need a certain charge, certain polarity. At the same time, you need some hydrophobicity. For that, the surface property will impact solubility, water holding, foaming, and emulsification. Okay. So let's start with water binding. So what is water binding capacity? So by its name, water is bound to the protein, or protein is capable of binding water. So you probably already talked about monolayers. So with regard to proteins, the monolayer is basically the water that is associated intensely, I would say, with the protein. It's bonded mostly via van der Waals and hydrogen bonding. So dipole-dipole are van der Waals. With the surface of the protein. So it is bound, not free anymore. So free water, unbound water is the water that is available for reactions in the food or for microbes. Okay? So this water is not available to any reactions, and it is bound tightly to the protein. There's also the entrapped water, which is also part of the bound water. You know, the protein structure is the three-dimensional structure, so there are gaps within the protein tertiary structure. Water can be entrapped in this protein matrix, and it's thus unable to flow freely. And the free water is the unbound water that is outside of the structure of the protein and is not bound to the protein. So you might hear these terms so that you want to know the difference. So bound water is the water that interacts via dipole-dipole and hydrogen bonding. The physically entrapped water that is within the polypeptide three-dimensional structure. And then the hydrodynamic water is another name for free water. Okay? Hydrodynamic because it has the movement and it is available for reaction. So if you hear these terms, you want to know the differences between them. So factors that affect water binding are many. Composition of the protein, basically the amino acids. The more polar amino acid bind more water. Charged amino acid bind more water than polar, more water than hydrophobic or nonpolar. Conformation, whether it's a native form or denatured, if the protein is denatured, it's going to also open up, you will have more surface for interactions with water. So although you are exposing hydrophobic groups, but you are exposing other groups as well that will interact with water. Protein concentration. Of course, the more protein you have in your mixture, the more water is going to be bound. Surface area, like I said, it has to do with how much available groups you have on the surface of the protein to interact with water. Temperature, as temperature increases, because you have kinetic energy, you'll have more movement, so you will have more binding of water at higher temperature, as well as if you reach denaturation of the protein, you'll bind a little bit more water as well. pH is an important factor because pH impacts the ionizable groups on the protein. If you increase the charge on the protein based on changing the pH, whether higher pH or lower pH, you are going to increase interaction sites with water. Again, salt concentration. Remember the concept of salting in and salting out. A small concentration of salt is going to add a charge load on the protein, and that will enhance protein binding with the water, but high concentration of salt will have the opposite effect. Okay, now in literature, or when you are actually looking at functionality of protein, you're going to hear two terms. And these two terms are often, very often, interchanged, but this is a mistake. They're not the same. So water binding is different than water holding. Can anybody guess the difference? Even scientists in the field make this mistake and interchange these terms, but they are different. Yes? Yeah, very good. So a gel, for example, if a protein forms a gel, what it's doing, it's holding water in its matrix. There is no chemical interactions. There are some water in proximity of the protein that is interacting with the protein, but there is just water physically entrapped in a network of a protein. Not in the structure of one polypeptide, but in the network of several proteins interacting together in a gel matrix. So water holding capacity is how much water a protein network, not one molecule, protein network can hold. And this is a very important characteristic. Okay. I thought I had something about water holding. Where is it? I had, I wanted to show how you would measure it. I don't know where that slide went. Do you have a picture of a meat on your, somewhere in your slides? Or it's not? It comes later? Oh, in the measurement of gelation. Okay, fine. So it will come later. Solubility. So this is the most, at most, important functionality for protein. Because if a protein is not soluble, it's not going to do anything for you. An example of a protein ingredient that will do nothing for you is corn protein. Industry is trying to produce an ingredient from corn and have a corn protein to compete with soy protein. Good luck with that. Corn protein is more than 40% hydrophobic. So it will not be soluble in water. It will not function. It's going to be the worst protein ingredient ever. Okay, so that is driving the idea that protein solubility is important. It impacts other functionality, not just for use in beverages. It's important to form a gel. It's important to emulsify. Otherwise, it won't interact with your liquid phase or aqueous phase. It's important for foam. It is important for everything, basically. Solubility, like I said, can be used as an index of denaturation because denatured protein has lower solubility than native protein in general. And it also depends on environmental conditions. Of course, it's an obvious thing. So you have salt, pH, and temperature. Let's look at that in a minute. So solubility is lower for protein with higher hydrophobicity, such as corn protein. It has a very high overall composition of hydrophobic residues, and on the surface is very hydrophobic. So if you have more net charge, you have more solubility. So both surface hydrophobicity and surface hydrophilicity have direct bearing on protein solubility. And let me clarify when I say surface, because the protein has a surface and residues exposed on the surface versus the interior components. So the surface of the protein impact the solubility because the other ones are hiding inside, unless the protein is denatured. Okay, so let's look at the impact of pH on solubility. It's kind of an obvious one because you increase the pH, you're going to add net charge. Decrease the pH, you're going to add a net charge. One is positive net charge for acidic, and basic is negative net charge. So here's an example of a soy protein solubility curve. So at low pH, you have solubility of about 70%. At high pH, alkaline, 8 or 9, you have very close to 100% solubility. At pH around 4, 4.5, 5, and around this kind of range, you have the lowest solubility. This is the isoelectric point of soy protein. That means the pH at which soy protein has 0 net charge. So when you have 0 net charge, you have the least solubility. So this is giving you another illustration of the impact of net charge on solubility. Okay, so one thing you might have noticed is that at alkaline conditions, you have more, although you have charged groups, you have more solubility than acidic. Can anybody make a very wild guess based on what you know about amino acids so far? Why you would expect higher solubility here? Okay. If you answer this, you get participation point and chocolate from my office. Okay, Lauren. Positive? You'll have more negative charge at alkaline, but yes, go ahead. It's the same protein, right? The same protein. Come on, I have a full bowl of chocolate. No. Okay. Give up? All right, remember, I don't know if you remember, but tyrosine has OH and cysteine has SH. These groups will give a hydrogen at alkaline pH. They will give a proton. So they will become negatively charged. So not only the carboxyl groups are negatively charged, and not only the amine groups gave up their protons, so you lose positive charge, you also have the tyrosine and cysteine that become negatively charged as well because the OH and SH give their protons. That's why, because you have more net negative charge due to other amino acids, not those that are originally acidic or basic. Okay, we'll see about that chocolate. So effect of temperature on solubility. As temperature increases, you have, in general, higher solubility because of the higher kinetic energy, more interactions with water. But above that temperature, proteins usually start to denature. Different proteins denature at different temperature. So you do have an increase in solubility up to a point where the protein denatures, and you see a decline in solubility. And another factor is disulfide linkages. Not just hydrophobic interactions are promoted with high temperature, also disulfide linkages, if you have sulfider groups, are promoted, and you get polymerization and irreversible denaturation or polymerization. So denatured protein tend to aggregate and precipitate. Okay? But if we induce denaturation under controlled mechanism, so controlled temperature and controlled rate of the temperature, we don't increase the temperature too fast. We gradually increase the temperature and gradually promote denaturation. Then we enhance other functionalities like gelation. Thermally induced gelation. A protein, like for example whey protein, won't denature unless you unless you denature it, so that you can promote protein-protein interactions and disulfide linkages. But you promote it in a controlled manner rather than heating at a high temperature and the temperature is rising very fast. Protein will denature and has no time to form a nice network. It will just polymerize, precipitate out of solution. So we use solubility of the protein and what we know about its solubility to produce ingredients. So this is an example of producing an ingredient based on what we know about the protein. So here's a soy protein example. So this soy protein example, we know that it is soluble at alkaline. Remember that solubility curve that I showed you at pH 8.5? It has excellent solubility. So we take the flour from soy and we want to separate protein from polysaccharides, mostly fiber in this case. We put the whole flour in alkaline solution, proteins will solubilize, fiber will precipitate. Now we have, in a solution, we have small molecular weight sugars and proteins. I want to let go of the sugars. I don't want the sugar, I just want the protein. So I bring the protein solution to isoelectric point of the soy. Around 4.5, it's going to precipitate out of solution. I bring the pH down. Then the sugars will remain in solution, proteins will precipitate. Then I'll take the precipitate, wash it very well, and then neutralize, because I don't want to leave the protein at isoelectric point. It won't be functional. So I neutralize, I spray dry, and I get a soy protein isolate. Or I can solubilize in aqueous alcohol, where the protein will actually denature and precipitate along with the fiber, and then sugars will be separated in solution. And then I will have a concentrate that is very high in protein, but it still has fiber in it. So there are different protein ingredients that can be produced, knowing the solubility of the protein and under which conditions they will precipitate, we can isolate them from a complex matrix. But denaturation of the protein can cause a problem in the processing equipment. We call it fouling of tubes. You probably will learn that in processing, I'm not sure. But if you are processing a solution or a mixture, fluid mixture high in protein, and you run it through pipes at high temperature, protein might denature and precipitate on the interior walls of the pipes, and we call that fouling, and that requires maintenance and cleaning of the pipes. So this is bad impact. How do we measure solubility? It's a very simple method to measure solubility. You put protein in solution at specific ionic strength and pH, and then you spin it down. You spin it down using microcentrifuge or a regular centrifuge, depending on the amount of solution you have. And then you take the supernatant and measure protein in the supernatant. And then you take that divided by the total protein, multiplied by 100, you get the amount of protein that was soluble. because some protein will precipitate, some will remain. If you take the amount that is in solution divided by the total amount of the protein, you get multiplied by 100, you get the percentage that is soluble. And there are different methods to measure protein in solution, Kaldal or nitrogen analyzer. You'll learn about that in a different class. And then, or you can do colorimetric method where you put a protein standard, bovine serum albumin standard, measure absorption, and use the equation of the line to get the concentration of the protein. And here's just an example that the solubility is impacted by heat. So non-heated whey protein isolate had 86% protein that is soluble, but when we heat it at 90 degrees, which is above the denaturation temperature of whey protein, and we heat it for an extended period of time, let's say 30 minutes, some of the protein will denature and precipitate, so you see a decrease in solubility. Okay, gelation. So it's a three-dimensional network where the protein interact with water and protein. So protein, and protein-water interaction. So the water is the dispersed phase, and the protein is the continuous phase because it is the network is formed through the protein. So and some gels can contain as little as 1% protein, especially gelatin can gel at really low concentration. So if we want to compare gels and form a gel as strong as gelatin gel using whey protein, you might need 5% of whey protein or 10% of whey protein to get a strong gel similar to 1% gelatin protein gel. So different proteins gel at different concentrations. Some are better gelating agents than others. Okay, so I just modified the slide to remove some detail. I just put here factors impacting gel is heat and pH. Remove the other two for now. Okay, and then what happens is when you heat the protein, it's going to partially denature and promote interaction. So you will form small aggregates. And with controlled heating and time, these aggregates are going to grow into a network. And you'll see here cavities in this network. That's where water is held. And that's what forms the gel, water held in a network. So there is a balance in this gel between attractive and repulsive forces. You don't want the protein to fuse together. So you do not want so many attractive forces between the proteins. You want some repulsion, but at the same time some interaction so that you form this nice network. So it is a very balanced system. You have the thermally irreversible. That means you form a gel, it stays a gel. And the example here is the egg white. It's a gel. And the reason it is irreversible because egg proteins are very large in molecular weight. Remember, the size of a protein impact gelation strength. So it's very large, and not only that, it is over 30% hydrophobic amino acid. So you're going to form very strong hydrophobic interactions, and they are irreversible. At this point, when there's a lot of them, it will be irreversible. And there's a lot of sulfhydryl groups in egg. So you will have disulfide linkages. So it forms a gel and it maintains a gel. I don't know from 3102 if you remember, collagen is the origin of gelatin. So collagen, in the native form of the protein, you heat it, it's going to form gelatin. So collagen is really stabilized. It's a very high in hydrophilic amino acid. So it's going to be stabilized by hydrogen bonding and electrostatic interactions. But when you heat it, if you remember that table of destabilizing the bonds, these bonds are destabilized at high temperature. So they're going to break, and you will have a mesh structure, mesh-like structure. So that's gelatin for you. If you cool it, hydrogen bonding and electrostatic interactions will reform, but they will reform in a different way, forming cavities where the water will be entrapped. and that's your gel. Heat again, what happens? These bonds are going to be broken again, and you have a liquid form again. So that is an irreversible form. You don't have so much of a disulfide, you don't have so much of hydrophobic interactions, and that's why it's reversible. So factors that impact gelation. So you have the molecular weight. If you have small proteins, they won't gel. One of my students working on camelina protein, we found that it doesn't form really good gels. And then when we looked at the size of the proteins, they were very small proteins. They don't form good gel. And if you hydrolyze the proteins and break them down to small molecular weight, they're not going to gel well for you either. So composition and surface charge, of course, you want to have some interactions. So it really depends on, do you have a lot of charge, net charge, or do you have a reasonable amount of charge to enhance interaction with water because you want to hold water. At the same time, you want to have protein-protein interactions. So composition of the protein is very important. If you have, like corn protein is very hydrophobic, it's not going to form a gel for you because it's just going to coagulate and precipitate because it's poorly soluble, and it's going to have very strong hydrophobic interactions. Okay, so we already said these types of bonds weaken as temperature increases, whereas hydrophobic interactions are enhanced as temperature increases. Disulfide bonds are enhanced at high temperature and alkaline conditions. So if you have a pH of 8 and you're heating up to, let's say, 80 degrees, perfect conditions to enhance disulfide linkages. Interaction with other proteins. If you have different proteins in the matrix, you might form better gels. So here are some examples. One application that is very relevant to you is yogurt or Greek yogurt. You know, water can synerese out of the yogurt. This is a bad quality with respect to the consumer, opening a yogurt and seeing water. So some formulators add whey protein to the additional than what's originally in the milk, because whey protein that is denatured is going to interact with kappa casein via disulfide linkages, enhance the strength of the gel, and enhance the entrapment of water. So that is a very applicable example. So environmental conditions that impact gelation, protein concentration, I told you already, like gelatin require 1%, whey protein you require 10%, soy protein you require 15% to form a strong gel. So it's really dependent on protein concentration and protein source. pH, too much charge, too much repulsion. High acidic, high alkaline, you're not going to get interactions between the proteins. So you want to find the optimal pH to have a balance. And again, this is different for different proteins. Same with the salt. Too much salt, you'll get aggregates and precipitation. A little bit of salt, you enhance interactions, you enhance the gel structure. So this picture illustrates what I'm talking about. Calcium ions, often they add calcium to the process of tofu, for example, because you want to enhance the proteins in soy to interact and form the tofu, which is a gel. So they add calcium ingredient. Again, heating temperature and heating rate, it's very important that protein is denatured to form the thermally induced gel. But at the same time, heating rate is very important. Heat it slowly to allow it to form that nice network. Heat it too fast, it's going to denature too fast, polymerize too fast, and precipitate. So the rate of heating is very important. Proteolytic enzymes. So if you want to make a jelly with pineapple, if you use pineapple fresh, the gel will not form. The jelly will not form. Why? Alex. Bromelain. You have bromelain in papaya, you have papain. In pineapple, you have bromelain, which is a protease. And it's going to break down your protein, and they become small peptides. They will not form a gel. So if you want to make a jelly with pineapple, get canned pineapples. Polysaccharides and sugar. Sometimes if you have polysaccharides in the system, it will enhance gelation because polysaccharides will enhance the water interaction. Sometimes you have a lot of sugar in there. It will compete with interacting with water, and you won't form a good gel. So you want to find the right concentration in the mixture to form a gel. How do we measure gelation? First of all, water holding capacity, like I said, is the water held in a gel, in a three-dimensional matrix. So you can do two tests when you are measuring, one test measuring two things, water holding and gelation. You can form a gel in a tube using a thermally induced treatment. So you put protein in solution, heat it, let it cool, forms a gel. You invert the tube and see how long it takes for the water to come out, or you measure a certain amount of time and then weigh the amount of water that drops out. You can, and then follow a calculation to determine water holding capacity of different protein at a particular protein concentration. Here's an example of meat patty. So here you have whey protein added to the meat patty. You don't see syneresis after cooking. And there's no whey protein added, so the water holding capacity is low. In order to measure water holding capacity of the patty, with and without whey protein, this is how you would do it. You put the meat in a tube, you know the fat and moisture content of that ground meat with and without whey protein. You cook, let it settle overnight, and then you measure the fat and volume of water that got separated from the meat. Even fat gets separated, and that's due to the fat holding capacity or the fat binding capacity, and that's a different one. And then you can measure using texture analyzer or other type of texture measurements to determine the strength of the gel, the strain, and the shear stress. So you can determine whether it's brittle, it breaks too fast, if it's mushy, rubbery, tough. Somewhere in the middle is what you have a consistent gel. Just last minute here, I just want to illustrate that different protein sources will have different functionalities because of their structure. Beta-lactoglobulin, very hydrophilic on the surface. Whey protein, excellent for beverages. Ovalbumin from eggs have a very good surface balance of hydrophilic to hydrophobic, have excellent foaming characteristics. Glycinin is a soy protein, is an excellent emulsifier, have excellent charge to hydrophobic balance. Gliadins and glutenins, excellent viscoelasticity properties. And then, of course, meat proteins, elasticity and gelation. So you have so many different protein ingredients. You learn about them in chemical reactions if you take that course, and their hydrolysate and how they function under different conditions. So, and also in chemical reactions, you learn about protein modification to enhance functionality, and there's so many different protein modification. One last thing I want to tell you here, you can do anything with biotechnology. So see this dog? You have two puppies and a kitten. This kitten is one of the litter. So it's genetically modified. So that's the mom. So you can do anything with proteins to change them and make them better. With that note, thank you and goodbye.